Welcome back. The battle over the Bundy Ranch has now ignited a number of Western lawmakers in a move to take back control of federal land. Joining us right now is one of those lawmakers, Utah State Representative, and one of the organizers of a summit that took place last weekend. Ken Ivory joins us today from Salt Lake City. Ken, good morning to you.
Good morning, Steve.
Before this cattle battle, you personally have been working for a couple of years to try to get under state control a lot of the land currently owned by the federal government. Why is that, Ken?
Well, we have this really radical idea, Steve, that the federal government ought to honor to the western states the very same statehood promise that it kept with all states east of Colorado. We learned in the statehood agreements that the federal government made the exact same promises at statehood to Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Louisiana, Alabama, that they made to the western states to transfer that land after statehood. We have about $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in these federally controlled lands, and yet, Steve, in our state, in Utah, we're $2.5 billion below average in per pupil funding for education.
Sure. We've got a map that we can put up that shows some of the states where, for instance, okay, those are the 9 states that were represented. Interesting that California not represented. We got one more map that shows some of the proportions. Look at the state of Nevada. 81% of it is owned by federal. You got half the state in Wyoming, 61% in Idaho. Ken, let me ask you this. If the states control the land rather than the federal government, how would things be different?
Well, what we're seeing, Steve, when you have a forest side by side, a state-controlled forest next to a federally controlled forest, when these massive catastrophic wildfires ravage through, they completely burn through the federal forest because they're not harvesting any timber. They're not tending the garden. And yet in the state forest, tribal forest, private forest, they drop to the ground. On state-managed land, you have states on average, study out of Nevada, states on average generate a positive $6.30 an acre positive net revenue, while at the same time the federal government loses $1.86.
Sure. You know, when you're talking about state officials controlling land as opposed to federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., it just always seems that, regardless of states' rights, it just seems like the people who are right there would have a better idea what to do with the land than somebody who lives in the 202 area code.
You know, those are the founding principles of our nation, right? Liberty, property, self-governance, that produces prosperity. That was the constitutional equation that we were given, and we're violating that. We're seeing the consequences. We're seeing the economic and environmental urgency is apparent, to quote Governor Steve Bullock from Montana at the Western Governors Association last year. Sure.
And now, Cliven Bundy, the fellow who's entangled with the Bureau of Land Management right now. The government says he is owing them $1 million in back grazing fees. He says he doesn't recognize federal authority on the land that his family has grazed on since the 1870s. Do you take a side in the Cliven Bundy saga?
Yeah, this is so much bigger than Bundy, Steve. The issues are all across the West where the federal government is exerting control over things it was never supposed to control. In short, going back from the Revolutionary War forward, the federal government was supposed to be a trustee. They do own the land. They do hold title to the land in trust. And right. Supreme Courts, Congresses, others have reiterated that point all the way up to our statehood. And so they hold title, but they have a duty to dispose of the land, just like they did with all states east of Colorado. In fact, Steve, there's a BYU Law Review article that came out a couple weeks ago that goes through in detail the legal background, constitutional background on the federal government's duty to dispose of these lands as a trustee. It simply just hasn't honored the same promise.
Well, let's hope they take notice and look at the historical precedent that's already happened. Ken Ivory, out there in Salt Lake City today. You're the first person up out in Salt Lake City. Good morning to you, and thank you very much for joining us on this Easter Monday.
Thanks, Steve.